My name is Alice Miller, and I am 31 years old. 72 hours ago, my father left his entire California real estate empire to my older brother, Nathan. He left me nothing, not a single dollar, not a fractional share. For 3 days, my mother paraded Nathan around San Francisco high society while I was erased from the family trust. Then this morning, I walked into the Miller corporate boardroom on the 52nd floor. The frosted glass doors swung inward, hitting the stops with a dull thud. Nathan was sitting at the head of the glass table with a silver pen in his hand, ready to sign away our father's legacy to cover his own debts. Chairman David Sterling sat beside him, smiling like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. I did not yell. I did not cry. I walked the length of the mahogany floorboards, listening to the sharp click of my own heels. I slid a crimson folder across the polished glass and watched it stop exactly in front of Nathan's folded hands. I told them the meeting was invalid. I looked my brother in the eye and told him that if his pen touched that paper, he would face federal fraud charges by noon. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and small. Sterling stopped smiling. Before I tell you exactly what was in that red folder and how I dismantled a billionaire board of directors, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Linda Vengeance. Only do it if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by your own blood. Also, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I want to know who is listening. Now let me take you back to Tuesday morning inside a suffocating legal office in the financial district, and the moment my family decided I no longer mattered. The air conditioning in Jonathan Sterling's corner office smelled of artificial lemon and expensive leather. I sat in a high-back chair, keeping my spine rigid against the upholstery. Across the wide oak desk, Nathan adjusted the knot of his silk tie. His foot tapped a restless rhythm on the thick carpet. Beside him, our mother Patricia traced the gold hardware on her pristine handbag. Her posture was flawless. Her eyes were dry. My father had been dead for 10 days, and she was already planning the estate auction. Jonathan cleared his throat. He turned the crisp page of the last will and testament. The paper rustled in the quiet room, sounding like a dry leaf. I watched his eyes scan the final paragraph. He took a slow breath before speaking. He stated that the entirety of the Miller real estate portfolio, inclusive of all commercial holdings and trust assets, transferred solely to Nathan. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I am a forensic accountant. I spend my days analyzing ledgers, finding hidden debts, and forcing equations to balance. This equation made no sense. My father taught me to read profit and loss statements when I was 10 years old. We spent Sunday mornings at the kitchen table mapping out commercial zoning laws while Nathan was out wrecking sports cars. My father groomed me for the business. Yet the legal document resting on the desk handed 4 decades of meticulous work to a son who had bankrupted 2 tech startups before his 30th birthday. Patricia leaned toward Nathan. Her shoulders shifted, turning her back slightly toward me, forming a physical barrier. "Your rightful place, darling," she whispered. The sound carried across the acoustic ceiling tiles. She did not look in my direction. She did not offer a hand or a word of comfort. I was a ghost in the room. I felt a familiar burning sensation in my chest, but I forced my jaw to relax. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I gathered my wool coat and stood. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor, breaking the silence. Nathan stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket. He offered a tight, practiced smile that failed to reach his eyes. "It takes a certain type of leader to handle a portfolio this size, Alice," he said. His tone was coated in false sympathy. "Dad knew you preferred working behind a desk. It is better this way." He was mocking me. He knew I had built the financial models that saved his last venture from total ruin. Patricia hooked her arm through his, patting his wrist. "We should go book the country club for the memorial reception," Patricia said. She finally glanced at me. Her gaze swept over my practical suit and flat shoes. "You can take a taxi home, Alice. We have a lot of arrangements to manage." They walked out of the suite, leaving the scent of heavy floral perfume hanging in the cold air. I turned to follow them. The brass door handle was cool against my palm. A quiet cough sounded from the desk. Jonathan had not moved. He sat perfectly still, watching the doorway. He waited until the heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us inside the soundproof room. He opened his bottom drawer. The metal hinges squeaked in the quiet space. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and slid it across the green desk blotter. "Your father asked me to give you this privately," Jonathan said. His voice dropped to a near whisper. He glanced at the closed door as if worried someone might be listening. He said, "You would understand why." I stepped back to the desk. The parchment felt heavy and textured under my fingertips. A dark red wax seal secured the flap, stamped with the old company crest. There was no return address. My name was the only thing written on the outside. I looked up at Jonathan. His hands were trembling slightly as he folded them on the desk. He was a seasoned estate lawyer who handled billion-dollar trusts every day. But right now, he looked terrified. "What is this, Jonathan?" I asked. "I do not know, Alice." He broke eye contact, looking down at his desk. "Richard brought it to my house the night before he died. He bypassed the firm entirely. He told me that if the board forced the primary will through, I was to hand you that envelope the moment Nathan left the room." The words hung in the air. If the board forced the will through, my father's heart attack had been sudden. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes. But my father had known something was coming. He knew the board of directors, led by Jonathan's own brother, David Sterling, was making a move. I slid the envelope into my leather briefcase. The metallic clasp snapped shut, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet office. I did not ask any more questions. A forensic accountant knows when a trail goes cold and when a new one begins. My father had not disinherited me. He had deployed me. I walked out of the legal suite and took the elevator down to the lobby. The San Francisco fog was rolling in thick and gray, obscuring the tops of the skyscrapers. I sat in my sedan overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I pulled the envelope from my briefcase. My thumb traced the edge of the wax seal. I pressed down, breaking the crest with a sharp snap. There was no emotional apology letter inside. There was no secret check. I tilted the envelope. A heavy brass key slid out, falling into my palm. It was cold and tarnished with age. Along with the key was a single piece of vintage company letterhead. A string of alphanumeric codes was printed across the center in my father's precise handwriting. I brought the paper closer to the fading light. A familiar scent drifted from the parchment. It was sandalwood and clove, my father's custom cologne. The smell grounded me, pulling me back to the reality of the puzzle he had left behind. I recognized the code structure immediately. It was a routing sequence for an offshore blind trust. He had removed me from the blast radius of a corporate war and handed me the detonator. My phone vibrated in the cup holder. A covert financial monitoring software I had discreetly installed on the family servers years ago triggered a red alert on my screen. Nathan was already initiating unauthorized wire transfers. The empire was bleeding. I started the engine. The golden child thought he had won. My mother thought she had protected him. The board thought they had secured their prize. But they forgot one crucial detail. You never leave the accountant alive. The fog rolling off the San Francisco Bay swallowed the hood of my sedan in a heavy gray wash. I parked near the battery overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, shutting off the engine. The silence of the cabin settled around me, sharp and isolating. I held the cream parchment envelope in my lap. My thumb traced the raised edges of the dark red wax seal. The Miller corporate crest pressed into the wax felt rough against my skin. I pressed my thumb down hard. The seal snapped with a crisp fracture. I did not rip the paper. I slid my index finger under the flap, opening it with deliberate care. I tipped the envelope over the center console. A heavy brass key tumbled out, striking the plastic with a hollow clatter. It was old. The edges were worn smooth, tarnished with the dull patina that comes from decades of handling. No modern digital lock used a key like this. This belonged to a safety deposit vault from an era before biometric scanners and digital keypads. A single sheet of paper followed the key fluttering down to rest on the passenger seat. The letterhead caught my eye. It was our company logo, but the design was outdated. It was the letterhead Miller Corporate used in the mid-1990s, long before the modern rebranding. I picked up the paper. As it moved through the air, a distinct scent filled the tight space of the car cabin. I closed my eyes. The scent was sandalwood and a sharp edge of clove. My father had his cologne custom blended by a private perfumer in Paris. He wore it every day of his life. The smell belonged to the leather armchair in his study. It belonged to the late nights he spent teaching me how to read amortization schedules while the rest of the house slept. The scent was woven into the paper fibers, deliberate and grounding. There was no handwritten letter. There were no final words of affection or explanation for the humiliating spectacle I had just endured at the lawyer's office. There was only a sequence of typed alphanumeric characters marching across the center of the page. I stared at the characters. My mind is conditioned to recognize patterns. It is what makes me a forensic accountant. I do not see random numbers. I see structural architecture. The sequence was 24 characters long, broken into 4 distinct blocks. The first block was a bank identification code, but it did not belong to Chase or Wells Fargo. The alphanumeric arrangement matched a boutique financial institution operating out of the Cayman Islands. The second block indicated an escrow routing protocol. The third and fourth blocks formed a highly secure cryptographic key. I realized what I was looking at. This was not a standard checking account or a hidden safety net. It was a routing sequence for an offshore blind trust. A blind trust is a financial vehicle where the beneficiaries have zero knowledge of the assets held within it and no right to intervene in their management. My father had established this structure decades ago. He had buried it so deep that probate court would never find it. The board of directors would never find it. Patricia and Nathan would never even know to look for it. The realization shifted the ground beneath me. Richard Miller had not cut me out of the will due to disappointment. The public disinheritance was a calculated maneuver. He had removed me from the blast radius. By leaving the visible empire to Nathan, my father painted a target on my brother's back. He gave the board exactly what they wanted, an arrogant, incompetent executive they could manipulate. My father left Nathan as bait. He left me the detonator. But what was the blast? Why did he need to shield me from the board so desperately? The answer arrived with a harsh vibration against my thigh. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated the dim interior of the sedan. The notification banner did not show a text message or an email. It displayed a string of red text from a hidden application I had built 3 years ago. When Nathan was appointed vice president of acquisitions, I knew his fragile ego would eventually threaten the company liquidity. I wrote a custom piece of financial monitoring software and embedded it directly into the Miller corporate servers. I designed the program to run silently in the background, analyzing outgoing capital. It only triggered an alert if a transaction exceeded $5 million without secondary executive approval. I swiped the notification, unlocking the phone. The dashboard of my software loaded on the screen. My heart beat a steady, rapid rhythm against my ribs. The numbers on the screen were climbing in real time. Nathan was at a private terminal. He was initiating wire transfers. The destination accounts were masked, bouncing through shell entities in Delaware and Nevada, but the source was undeniable. He was pulling capital directly from the operational reserves of our San Jose Tech campus. The Tech campus was the crown jewel of our real estate portfolio. It generated steady, reliable revenue from long-term leases signed by global tech conglomerates. It was the anchor that kept Miller Corporate stable during market fluctuations. Selling it or leveraging it was corporate suicide. I watched a transfer of $12 million clear the internal security protocol. 2 minutes later, another transfer for $8 million hit the pending queue. Nathan was bypassing the standard 30-day escrow holds. He was authorizing immediate release forms. I tapped the glass screen, drilling down into the transaction metadata. The authorizing signature belonged to Nathan, but the receiver was listed as a holding company called Vanguard Apex. I cross-referenced the name against our approved vendor database. Vanguard Apex did not exist in our system. They had no history with Miller Corporate. They were a ghost entity. The empire was bleeding. Nathan was draining the lifeblood of our company, slicing into the main artery of our operational capital. A normal executive would never liquidate a flagship asset within hours of inheriting the title. A normal board of directors would never allow an unproven CEO to move $20 million into a blind holding company on a Tuesday morning. The compliance department should have flagged the transactions immediately. The risk management team should have frozen the accounts pending a full review. But no one was stopping him. The board of directors was letting it happen. I looked back at the alphanumeric code on the vintage letterhead. My father knew this day would come. He knew Chairman David Sterling and the board had been waiting for the moment they could gut the company and sell the parts for their own profit. They just needed someone stupid enough to sign the paperwork and take the fall. Nathan was walking right into their trap, blinded by his desperate need to project authority. He was liquidating the campus to cover something personal. I knew my brother's financial habits well. He lived on margin. He leveraged his allowances to fund venture capital projects that always failed. He owed someone a significant amount of money, and he was using our father's legacy to pay the debt. If I did nothing, Miller Corporate would be insolvent by the end of the week. Nathan would face federal prison for corporate fraud, and the board would walk away with the assets clean. I placed the brass key and the letterhead back into the envelope and locked it inside my glove compartment. I dropped my phone into the cup holder. I shifted the car into drive. The tires gripped the wet asphalt as I pulled away from the overlook. I needed to know exactly who Vanguard Apex really was. And to find that out, I had to track Nathan's digital footprint into the real world. I had to see who was holding his leash. My brother thought he was the king of Silicon Valley today. He was about to find out he was just the sacrifice. The blue light from 3 curved monitors cast long, harsh shadows across my apartment living room. 48 hours had passed since the will reading in the financial district. 48 hours since my name was erased from the Miller legacy. I sat in my ergonomic chair watching lines of encrypted data scroll across the center screen. Forensic accounting is not simply about tracking dollars and cents. It is the study of human behavior mapped through numbers. A ledger never lies. It reveals panic, greed, and desperation long before a person ever speaks a word. Right now, the numbers on my screen were screaming. My shadow surveillance software chimed a soft, rhythmic alert. I had embedded the tracking protocol deep within the company network months ago, anticipating a disaster. The program monitored executive login credentials and geolocated their active IP addresses. Nathan's digital token had just pinged a new location. The coordinates placed him at a private members club in Menlo Park, surrounded by the manicured golf courses of Silicon Valley. It was an exclusive sanctuary where venture capitalists drank expensive scotch and dismantled vulnerable companies behind closed doors. I pulled up the corporate cloud directory on my left monitor. I watched the metadata populate in real time. Nathan was not having a casual lunch. His digital calendar synced with the active network session, revealing 6 attendees. Chairman David Sterling was at the top of the roster, followed by 4 senior members of our board of directors. They were holding a clandestine meeting miles away from the official Miller corporate headquarters. Conducting unrecorded business outside the primary office violated 3 internal compliance bylaws. They were hiding something. A new document appeared in the shared executive drive. I intercepted the data packet before it could be fully encrypted, dragging the file onto my desktop. I stripped the security header and opened the PDF. It was a preliminary term sheet. The title printed at the top of the page made the breath catch in my throat. San Jose Technology Park Liquidation Strategy. The San Jose campus was our fortress. My father purchased that sprawling acreage in the early 2000s, long before the software boom turned the valley into a real estate gold rush. He spent a decade securing airtight 30-year leases with global hardware manufacturers and server farms. The property generated predictable, immense revenue. It was the financial anchor that kept our entire portfolio steady during market recessions. Selling it was the equivalent of corporate suicide. I scrolled down to the valuation clause. The figure listed on the contract was an insult. Nathan was pricing the anchor property at a 40% discount off the current market appraisal. It was a fire sale. He was proposing a direct transfer of the deed to Vanguard Apex, the shadow private equity firm I had flagged in the wire queues yesterday. Executives do not liquidate their most valuable assets at a severe loss unless they are drowning. I pivoted to my right monitor, accessing a backdoor into Nathan's personal credit profile. I had breached his personal firewall a year ago when his spending habits became erratic. My brother masked his financial reality well, hiding his liabilities behind offshore holding companies and rotating lines of credit. He wore bespoke suits and leased luxury vehicles to maintain the illusion of success. But the core problem was glaringly obvious in the spreadsheets. Nathan had poured substantial capital into a virtual reality hardware startup. The venture filed for bankruptcy last quarter, burning through his initial investment and triggering a cascade of penalty fees. The private lenders who backed his play had lost their patience. They issued a margin call. They demanded their capital back immediately. Nathan owed $50 million. He did not possess $50 million in liquid cash. His net worth was entirely tied up in the Miller corporate stock he had just inherited. But selling his own shares on the open market would signal weakness to our investors. The stock price would plummet. His ego could not handle the public humiliation of a failed venture. Instead, he chose a darker path. He was cannibalizing our father's company to quietly cover his own mistakes. He intended to use the proceeds from the San Jose fire sale to secretly bridge his margin call before the lenders seized his personal assets. I watched the digital signatures populate on the term sheet. David Sterling signed the preliminary approval first. The other 4 board members applied their cryptographic signatures in quick succession. They were rubber stamping the fire sale. I stopped typing. The quiet hum of my computer fan filled the silence in the room. This made no logical sense. A board of directors has a strict legal obligation to maximize shareholder value. Approving a steep discount on a flagship property was corporate malpractice. If the shareholders found out, the board would face a barrage of class action lawsuits. I stared at Sterling's glowing digital signature on the screen. It was too easy. Sterling was a predator who had spent 20 years circling my father's desk, waiting for a moment of weakness. He did not give away prime real estate out of kindness. He was not signing that paper to help Nathan solve a personal debt crisis. He was handing Nathan the shovel to dig his own grave. The legal architecture of the trap clicked into place in my mind. Fiduciary duty. If a chief executive officer orchestrates the sale of a core company asset at a deliberate loss to benefit his personal financial situation, it constitutes a severe breach of fiduciary duty. It is a federal crime. By signing that preliminary term sheet, Sterling and the board were not helping my brother. They were meticulously documenting his crime. They were creating a flawless, undeniable paper trail. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. They would let Nathan execute the final sale, transfer the funds, and plug his margin call. The moment the ink dried on the final transfer, Sterling would convene an emergency board meeting. He would present the evidence of Nathan's self-dealing. They would vote to oust him for corporate fraud. Nathan would be removed from the building in handcuffs. The board would seize total control of the company, and Vanguard Apex would walk away with the most valuable real estate in Northern California for pennies. Nathan was walking straight into a slaughterhouse. He was so blinded by panic and his desperate need to project authority that he could not see the walls closing in. He thought he was playing a game of high finance, but he was just the bait. I refreshed the banking dashboard. The escrow accounts were being prepped. The wire queues began to stack up in the system, waiting for the final execution order scheduled for Monday morning. The money was preparing to move. Once those funds crossed state lines into the Vanguard Apex accounts, the damage would be irreversible. The Miller legacy would be fractured beyond repair. I sat back in my chair, rubbing the tension from my temples. I knew the trap. I knew the players. I knew the exact timeline. But knowledge without leverage is useless. Legally, I was a ghost. I held no executive title. I owned 0 shares. My name had been systematically scrubbed from the family trust. If I walked into the authorities with this intercepted data, Sterling would claim it was a legitimate business transaction and bury me in defamation lawsuits before the sun went down. If I tried to warn Nathan, his fragile pride would force him to double down. He would sign the papers faster just to prove he was in charge. He would never believe that his supportive board members were actually his executioners. I needed a weapon to stop the transaction before the escrow window closed. My father's vintage letterhead sat on my desk, the alphanumeric routing code waiting to be decoded. The blind trust was my only hope. But to understand how to deploy that weapon, I needed to understand the blind spot that allowed this disaster to happen in the first place. My mother had engineered the public will. She had convinced my father to hand Nathan the keys to a machine he did not know how to drive, leaving our flank entirely exposed to predators like Sterling. If I was going to dismantle the board and save the empire, I had to understand the architecture of my mother's betrayal. I had to face the woman who decided I was expendable. The Pacific Heights estate sat behind towering wrought iron gates, a sprawling Victorian monument to the Miller family legacy. I navigated my sedan up the curving driveway. The manicured lawns were green and pristine, defying the persistent California drought through an expensive underground irrigation system. Everything about this property was designed to project an image of wealth and invulnerability. I killed the engine. The silence of the neighborhood pressed heavily against the car windows. I stepped out into the damp morning air and walked toward the heavy oak front doors. I did not bother ringing the chime. I used my brass key, the one I had carried on my keyring since I received my driver's license. The foyer smelled of fresh lilies and lemon wax, a direct and suffocating mirror of the lawyer's office. My footsteps echoed on the imported marble tiles. The house felt hollow. For decades, my father filled these rooms with the low hum of business calls and the scent of dark roast coffee. Now the space belonged to my mother. I found Patricia in the glass-enclosed sunroom at the back of the estate. The morning light filtered through the panes, casting geometric shadows across the terracotta floor. She stood beside a wrought iron potting table, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater and pearl earrings. Her attention was focused on a shallow ceramic pot containing a Japanese juniper bonsai tree. She held a pair of sharp steel shears in her right hand. She did not look up when I crossed the threshold. The silver blade snapped shut, severing a small green shoot. The clipping fell to the table with a soft rustle. "Hello, Alice," she said. Her tone was brisk, the kind of voice one uses to address a punctual employee. She positioned the shears around another delicate branch. I watched the precision of her movements. She was meticulously shaping the tree, forcing it to conform to her specific aesthetic vision. I stepped closer to the table. "We need to talk about Nathan," I said. I kept my voice level, stripping away any trace of panic. Patricia sighed. The blades paused in midair. "If this is about the will, Alice, we have already concluded that discussion. Your father made his wishes clear." "He did not make them clear," I replied. "He made them public. There is a difference. But that is not why I am here. Nathan is liquidating the San Jose Tech campus. He initiated the wire transfers this morning. He is selling the property to a shadow equity firm at a 40% discount to cover a personal margin call." The shears snapped again. Another healthy leaf drifted to the damp soil. "Nathan is the chief executive," she said. "He is restructuring the portfolio. David Sterling assured me it is a standard strategic pivot." "Sterling is lying to you," I said, taking another step forward. The distance between us was less than 3 feet, but it felt like a canyon. "Sterling is using the sale to trap Nathan. The moment the funds clear, the board will vote to remove him for breaching his fiduciary duty. They will seize the company, and Nathan will face federal charges. I intercepted the term sheets. I have the digital proof." For the first time, Patricia stopped cutting. She lowered the shears, resting her hands on the edge of the potting table. She stared at the thick, twisted trunk of the bonsai. Her knuckles were white. "You always do this, Alice," she murmured. "You analyze, you calculate, you look at your brother and you only see a liability. You never see his potential." "I am looking at a federal indictment," I countered. "I am trying to save him." Patricia shook her head. Her jaw tightened. She picked up the shears again. Her eyes traced the lines of the juniper, searching for imperfections. "Your father wanted to split the trust," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual social polish. The admission hit me like a physical blow. The humid air in the sunroom suddenly felt thin. 5 years ago, Patricia continued, her gaze fixed on the tree. Richard drafted a succession plan. 50% for you, 50% for Nathan, co-chairs of the board. He thought it was the most logical solution. I watched her hands. The steel blades hovered over a thick, vibrant branch extending upward, reaching for the sunlight pouring through the glass. "Why did he change it?" I asked. My voice barely cracked. Patricia squeezed the handles. The blades bit into the wood with a sharp, decisive snap. "Because I told him to," she said. The thick branch fell to the table. She had severed the strongest part of the tree to maintain a stunted, artificial symmetry. "Your brother needs the validation, Alice. He requires the title, the authority, the visible proof of his worth. If Richard had split the company, Nathan would have spent his entire life comparing himself to you. He would have felt inadequate." Patricia turned the ceramic pot, inspecting the new, diminished shape of the bonsai. "You have always been too analytical, too independent. You do not need us. You never needed this empire to prove you are capable. Nathan does." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She refused to make eye contact. She kept her focus locked on the soil, brushing away the fallen leaves with her manicured fingers. She was effectively framing my competence as the justification for my abandonment. Because I was strong, I deserved nothing. Because Nathan was weak, he deserved everything. She had sacrificed my future to shield his fragile ego. She had engineered the public will, convincing my father to hand a billion-dollar real estate portfolio to a son who treated capital like casino chips. A strange clarity washed over me. The burning sensation in my chest vanished, replaced by a cold, forensic calm. The emotional tether that had tied me to this house, to her approval, snapped. It was a clean break. If my mother chose the illusion of the golden child over the reality of the daughter standing right in front of her, I would no longer offer my protection. I would let the illusion shatter. I did not raise my voice. I did not demand an apology. I simply took a step back. "Enjoy your tree, Patricia," I said. The words hung in the humid air of the sunroom. She did not reply. The sharp click of the shears resumed as I turned and walked away. I navigated the long hallways, tracing my path back to the front door. The house was a museum to a family that no longer existed. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, the lock engaging with a solid thud. I walked down the driveway to my car. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the gray waters of the bay in the distance. The rules of engagement had changed. I was no longer fighting to save my brother or preserve my mother's pristine social image. I was fighting for the legacy my father actually intended to leave behind. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The clock was ticking. It was Friday afternoon. Nathan's fire sale was scheduled to execute on Monday morning. I had less than 72 hours to freeze the transaction. I retrieved the vintage letterhead and the brass key from the glove compartment. The alphanumeric code stared back at me. My father had built a hidden structure, a vault, designed to bypass Patricia's manipulation and the board's greed. I needed to trace the routing sequence to its physical location. I turned the ignition, steering the sedan away from Pacific Heights and driving straight toward the financial district. I had a lock to find. The financial district of San Francisco operates on a different frequency than the rest of the city. The towering glass facades project modern wealth, but the real power resides in the stone foundations built a century ago. I navigated my sedan through the narrow streets intersecting Montgomery Street. The alphanumeric routing code printed on my father's vintage letterhead did not point to a commercial branch. It directed me to an address tucked between two corporate high-rises. The building had no exterior signage. A simple brass plaque beside the heavy bronze doors read, Montgomery Depository. It was a subterranean private bank. Institutions like this cater exclusively to generational wealth, offering anonymity over convenience. I parked in a nearby underground garage and walked through the biting fog. The brass handle of the depository door felt freezing against my palm. The interior lobby resembled a museum rather than a financial institution. Walnut paneling lined the walls. A thick Persian runner silenced my footsteps. An attendant in a tailored suit stood behind a polished marble counter. He did not greet me with the standard corporate script. He merely offered a polite nod, waiting for me to declare my purpose. I did not speak. I placed the vintage letterhead on the marble surface. The attendant glanced at the alphanumeric sequence. His posture stiffened a fraction of an inch. He picked up the paper, examining the faded company crest and the routing code. "Right this way, Miss Miller," he said. He did not ask for my identification. The code itself was the authorization. He led me to a discreet elevator hidden behind a decorative screen. We descended 3 floors below street level. The air grew cooler, carrying the dry, filtered scent of climate-controlled storage. The elevator doors parted to reveal a sprawling vault complex. Walls of stainless steel deposit boxes stretched down long, silent corridors. The attendant guided me to row 84. He stopped in front of a rectangular steel door. He inserted a master electronic key into the upper slot, triggering a sharp, mechanical click. He stepped back, gesturing toward the lower keyhole. I retrieved the tarnished brass key from my coat pocket. I slid it into the lock. It turned with heavy resistance. The internal tumblers aligned, and the small steel door swung open. The attendant bowed his head and walked away, granting me total privacy. I reached into the dark cavity of the lockbox. My fingers brushed against cold metal and smooth leather. I pulled out a thick journal bound in cracked black hide. Beneath it lay a standard unbranded USB drive. There were no other documents, no stacks of cash, no velvet pouches of jewelry, just information. The depository provided secure viewing rooms adjacent to the main vault. I carried the journal and the drive into a small cubicle furnished with a single desk and a leather chair. I closed the door, sealing myself inside the soundproof chamber. I sat down and opened my laptop. I plugged the USB drive into the port. A security prompt immediately filled the screen, demanding a 24-character decryption key. The firewall was robust, utilizing high-level encryption protocols. A brute force hacking attempt would take centuries to break it. I referenced the vintage letterhead, typing the sequence my father had provided. The progress bar stalled for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing green. The drive unlocked. A single folder appeared on my desktop. The title read, Shadow Ledger. I clicked the icon. Hundreds of scanned documents, spreadsheets, and audio transcripts populated the screen. I opened the first spreadsheet. It detailed transactions dating back 12 years. As a forensic accountant, I read financial flowcharts the way musicians read sheet music. The melody here was dark and parasitic. My father had spent over a decade quietly tracking his own board of directors. The ledger documented every covert attempt Chairman David Sterling made to devalue the California portfolio. Sterling had been orchestrating phantom bids on commercial leases, scaring away legitimate tenants to drive down property values. He funneled maintenance contracts to shell companies owned by his associates, siphoning operational funds in small, undetectable increments. Sterling was a parasite feeding off the Miller empire, but he was always careful to stay just inside the boundaries of legal, plausible deniability. My father knew he could never fire Sterling without concrete proof of a direct crime. The board would just close ranks and vote my father out. So my father devised a lethal countermeasure. I opened a text document dated 3 months before his death. It contained a typed summary of his final strategy. The board is impatient, the note read. They want the core assets, but I have barricaded the equity. To expose a predator, you must offer an irresistible target. I am altering the public will. I am leaving the entire structure to Nathan. Nathan lacks the discipline to govern and the humility to learn. He will over-leverage the portfolio within 6 months. The board will recognize his desperation. They will offer him a terrible deal, encouraging him to breach his fiduciary duty. Once he signs the paper, they will trap him. They will oust him and absorb the company. I stared at the glowing screen. My chest felt tight. My father had sacrificed Nathan's reputation to save the company. The text continued. I have hidden a poison pill protocol deep within the corporate bylaws. It is a dormant legal mechanism that allows a Class A shareholder to enact an immediate, permanent freeze on all legacy asset transfers if fraud is detected. When the board springs their trap on Nathan, they will expose their own shadow entities. You must let them think they have won, Alice. Then, cut the strings. I leaned back in the leather chair. The brilliance of the strategy was staggering. By engineering his own succession crisis, my father forced the board to move out of the shadows. He gave them the golden child on a silver platter. I clicked into the subfolder labeled Poison Pill Protocol. The legal framework was flawless. If I could activate this clause, I could halt the San Jose campus fire sale and simultaneously trigger an automatic federal audit of the board of directors. Sterling would be stripped of his power and the company would be locked down. But a glaring obstacle halted my rising momentum. To trigger the freeze, the protocol required undeniable proof of the buyer's fraudulent intent. I needed to legally link Chairman Sterling to Vanguard Apex, the private equity firm purchasing the San Jose campus. I needed the exact corporate identification numbers, the hidden incorporation documents that tied Sterling's personal wealth to the shadow buyer. I searched the shadow ledger for Vanguard Apex. A file path appeared at the bottom of the directory. I clicked it eagerly. An error message flashed across the screen. The data is corrupted. I tried to run a recovery diagnostic. The software spun for a moment before returning a bleak result. The final pages of the ledger had sustained permanent digital decay. My father had tracked dozens of Sterling's shell companies, but the specific incorporation details for Vanguard Apex were lost. I hit my desk with an open palm. The sound echoed sharply in the small viewing room. I had the weapon. The poison pill was real. But without the corporate identification linking Sterling to Vanguard Apex, I could not prove the fraud. I could not trigger the protocol. I had no ammunition. I closed the laptop and ran a hand through my hair. It was late Friday afternoon. Nathan's reckless sale would finalize on Monday morning. Sterling had insulated himself perfectly. Vanguard Apex was a ghost entity, shielded by layers of complex legal confidentiality. Calling their offices would yield nothing. Searching public records would only produce fake names and dead ends. I packed the journal and the laptop into my briefcase. I walked out of the subterranean bank, stepping back into the chilling San Francisco fog. I could not crack Vanguard Apex from behind a computer screen. I needed to extract the information from the inside. I needed someone closely connected to Nathan, someone who lacked discipline, someone who was bleeding money and desperate to complain about it. I needed to find my sister-in-law, and I knew exactly where she would be spending her Friday night. The commercial flight from San Francisco to Los Angeles took barely an hour, but the transition between worlds felt vast. I parked a rented sedan blocks away from the Wilshire Hotel. The charity gala hosted within its walls was the epicenter of West Coast high society tonight. I bypassed the red carpet where cameras flashed like strobe lights. My entry point was the concrete loading dock behind the kitchen. A high-quality forged vendor credential hung from a lanyard around my neck. I wore a simple black catering uniform, blending seamlessly into the chaotic stream of event staff carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres. The air in the service corridors smelled of roasted garlic and industrial dish soap. Through the swinging wooden doors, the main ballroom radiated a different atmosphere entirely. I slipped into the shadows near a secondary bar station, observing the ecosystem of the elite. The room shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Silicon Valley executives rubbed shoulders with Hollywood producers. False warmth disguised predatory networking. My brother stood near a towering swan ice sculpture. Nathan wore a custom velvet dinner jacket that cost more than my first car. He held a tumbler of expensive scotch, laughing too loud at a joke told by a venture capitalist. He projected the image of a fearless leader who had just inherited a real estate kingdom. I needed to reach the guest restrooms on the opposite side of the venue. Navigating the perimeter meant crossing a sliver of the main floor. I kept my head down, carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes. But Nathan's radar for a captive audience was sharp. He turned to signal a waiter and caught my reflection in the mirrored wall. "Well, look who decided to crash the party," Nathan announced. His tone cut through the classical music playing in the corner. Several heads turned in our direction. He closed the distance between us, flanked by two sycophants hoping for a crumb of his new wealth. "Did Jonathan forget to read the fine print?" "Alice," he asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "the guest list is reserved for donors, not disinherited accountants looking for a free meal." Heat crawled up the back of my neck, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and measured. The irony of the moment was thick enough to choke on. He stood there, soaking in the attention, attempting to humiliate me in front of the donor class. He had no idea I spent the afternoon inside a subterranean vault holding the digital keys to his impending ruin. He was a dead man walking, bragging about the shine on his shoes. I did not shrink away. I looked at the scotch in his hand, then met his gaze. "Enjoy the evening, Nathan," I said quietly. "The bill always comes due." He scoffed, turning back to his audience. "Let security know we have a stray," he tossed over his shoulder. I abandoned the tray on a nearby table and slipped down the marble hallway. I had not come to Los Angeles to fight my brother. I came to exploit his weakest link, Jessica Miller. My sister-in-law grew up in a minor political family on the East Coast. She was raised to value optics above all else. Her entire identity hinged on favorable tabloid mentions, exclusive country club memberships, and unlimited credit lines. If Nathan was facing a $50 million margin call, the financial strain would be fracturing their marriage behind closed doors. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door of the ladies' lounge. The space was an oasis of rose gold mirrors and velvet seating, smelling of expensive floral perfumes. Jessica leaned over the sprawling marble vanity. She was applying a harsh layer of red lipstick. Her hands were noticeably unsteady. 2 empty martini glasses sat on a small side table near her clutch. "Hello, Jessica," I said. She jumped, smudging the crimson pigment across her lip line. She grabbed a tissue and glared at me through the mirror. "What are you doing here, Alice? Did Nathan send you to check on me? Are you on his payroll now?" I leaned against the doorframe, adopting a posture of shared exhaustion. Nobody sent me. I just needed a quiet place to breathe. Men like Nathan tend to suck the oxygen out of the room. Jessica paused. The tissue hovered near her mouth. The hostility in her eyes shifted into a cloudy, alcohol-fueled resentment. She had been bottling up a storm, and my feigned empathy provided the perfect release valve. "Tell me about it," she muttered, turning to face me. She gripped the edge of the vanity. "He is acting like the king of the world out there. Meanwhile, my black card declined at a boutique in Rodeo Drive this afternoon." "Declined, Alice? Do you know how humiliating that is?" The sales associate looked at me like I was a beggar. I offered a sympathetic nod, channeling the cadence of a trusted confidant. "He has always been terrible with cash flow. He locks up the liquid assets for his ego projects and leaves everyone else scrambling to cover the daily expenses. It is exhausting to manage." "Exactly," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "He froze the discretionary trust accounts. He claims it is just a temporary liquidity restructuring, but I heard him screaming on the phone in his private study yesterday. He was begging some private equity firm for a grace period." I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse accelerated. The bait was set. "Begging is not a good look for a newly minted chief executive," I murmured. "Did he mention who is holding his leash?" Jessica rolled her eyes, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Some shadow outfit in New York, Vanguard Apex Holdings. He wired them our summer house maintenance fund, just to keep them quiet until Monday morning. It is predatory lending, Alice. We are practically destitute, and he is out there buying drinks for strangers. The pebble of information dropped perfectly into the calm waters of my mind. Vanguard Apex Holdings, operating out of New York. It was a precise, actionable target. The missing piece of the shadow ledger was now in my possession. Finding a specific corporate entity in a sea of shell companies is like finding a loose thread on a sweater. Once you isolate the thread, you can unravel the entire garment. I offered Jessica a warm, entirely fabricated smile. You deserve better than financial instability, Jessica. Make sure he fixes it before the market opens on Monday. I left her staring at her ruined makeup in the mirror. I bypassed the main ballroom, exiting through the kitchen loading dock, back into the cool night air. The valet stand was a blur of luxury vehicles, but I walked past them toward the dark street corner where I parked. The puzzle pieces were aligning. I had the name of the enemy. But as I unlocked my car door, a new, daunting realization settled over me. Knowing the name of the firm was only half the equation. Vanguard Apex was a shielded corporate fortress. The deadline had just accelerated. Nathan was already bleeding cash to them, sending maintenance funds to delay the inevitable. That meant the board was tightening the noose faster than my father had originally predicted. I needed to pierce the corporate veil of a New York financial institution from a laptop in California. And I had less than 40 hours to find the undeniable proof that Chairman Sterling was the man behind the curtain. The red-eye flight back to San Francisco deposited me at my apartment just before 3 in the morning. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The glow from my workstation illuminated the living room, casting sharp angles across the hardwood floor. I dropped my coat on the sofa and sat in my ergonomic chair. My pulse maintained a steady, accelerated rhythm. I had the name. Vanguard Apex Holdings, operating out of New York. Now I needed to tear down their corporate veil. I opened my primary forensic software suite and linked it to a secure proxy server. I bypassed the standard search engines, connecting directly to the New York Department of State Division of Corporations database. I typed the entity name into the query field and pressed Enter. The initial results were predictably opaque. Vanguard Apex Holdings was registered as a limited liability company 2 years ago. The registered agent was a generic compliance firm in Albany. The managing members were listed as 2 other corporate entities operating out of Delaware. This is standard architecture for individuals hiding wealth. You nest a shell company inside another shell company, creating a legal labyrinth designed to exhaust anyone trying to follow the money. But I am a forensic accountant. Labyrinths are my specialty. I initiated a recursive algorithm designed to trace the tax identification numbers of the parent companies. The software hummed, parsing through thousands of public records, property deeds, and offshore registry leaks. I leaned back, watching the data lines cascade across the center screen. My father taught me that true power never leaves its money unattended. A predator always maintains a hidden thread to pull the capital back to the source. The algorithm hit a match. A secondary server cluster generated a network graph on my right monitor. The Delaware entities were controlled by an offshore trust located in the British Virgin Islands. I cross-referenced the trust registry number against the shadow ledger data I had retrieved from the subterranean vault earlier that day. The lines connected. The node flashed red. The offshore trust holding the reins of Vanguard Apex belonged to Chairman David Sterling. The breath stalled in my lungs. The New York equity firm was not an independent financial predator swooping in to exploit a struggling heir. The firm was Sterling. He was sitting at the head of our boardroom, nodding sympathetically at my brother's manufactured debt crisis, while secretly orchestrating the margin call from across the country. Sterling was actively stealing the San Jose Tech campus for himself at pennies on the dollar. He was using Nathan's fragile ego to bypass federal oversight, effectively transferring a cornerstone of the Miller real estate portfolio into his own pockets. The betrayal was surgical. He had engineered the entire scenario to capture a billion-dollar asset without triggering an alarm. I shifted my attention back to the shadow ledger on my left monitor. I needed to arm the countermeasure. I opened the encrypted file containing the poison pill protocol. The legal document was drafted by my father, written with precise corporate vernacular. I read the text carefully, analyzing the mechanics of the trap. The clause was buried in an obscure section of the company bylaws regarding emergency asset preservation. It dictated that any unauthorized liquidation of legacy properties could be frozen permanently without a majority board vote. The mechanism bypassed the chief executive officer. It bypassed the chairman. It acted as an emergency brake on the entire corporation, designed to halt catastrophic theft in its tracks. But a legal mechanism requires a key. I scrolled down the page to find the activation requirements. To trigger the freeze, the challenge must be formally submitted by a vested shareholder possessing a minimum of 5% of Class A voting stock. I read the sentence a second time, then a third. The reality of my situation crashed over me like cold water. The poison pill was structurally flawless, but I lacked the clearance to use it. A shareholder possessing 5% of Class A voting stock, I owned 0%. The public will read by Jonathan in the legal suite had stripped me of my inheritance. I was legally disinherited. I had 0 shares, 0 voting power, and 0 standing within Miller Corporate. If I walked into the boardroom on Monday morning with the shadow ledger in hand, Sterling would simply call security. I had no legal right to even enter the room, let alone file an injunction to freeze a major corporate transaction. I could hand the evidence to the authorities, but white-collar fraud investigations take months to initiate. By the time a federal agent knocked on Sterling's door, the tech campus would be sold, the money laundered, and the Miller legacy dismantled. I glanced at the digital clock on my taskbar. It was 4 a.m. on Saturday. Nathan's asset sale was scheduled to close at a 9 o'clock board meeting on Monday. I had less than 53 hours. 53 hours before Sterling absorbed the company. 53 hours before my brother signed his own federal indictment. I was trapped in a paradox. I held the systemic proof required to destroy a corrupt board of directors, but I lacked the legal status to deploy it. I was a sniper, staring through a scope with no trigger to pull. The plan my father constructed was genius, but he had left a fatal flaw in the architecture. By engineering the public will to bait the board, he had inadvertently locked me out of the armory. The exhaustion I had been suppressing for 3 days settled deep into my bones. The adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. I closed my laptop. The monitors went dark, plunging the apartment back into shadows. I sat in the silence, listening to the distant hum of traffic on the city streets below. I had failed. I possessed all the answers and none of the power. My mother had won. She had convinced my father to rewrite the history of our family, and in doing so, she had handed the kingdom to the wolves. I reached across the desk, picking up the original cream-colored envelope Jonathan had given me. The wax seal was already broken. The brass key and the vintage letterhead were safely locked in my car glove compartment. I held the empty parchment in my hands, seeking a small measure of comfort from the lingering scent of sandalwood and clove. My father was a meticulous man. He never wasted an action. He never left a loose end. I ran my thumb along the bottom edge of the paper, tracing the heavy cardstock. My thumb paused. I traced the edge again. The tactile sensation registered in my mind, cutting through the thick fog of fatigue. Standard stationery envelopes are crafted from a single sheet of folded paper. The bottom seam should feel thin and uniform. The seam resting under my thumb felt rigid. It was artificially thick. I sat up straight in my chair. I brought the envelope closer to the ambient light filtering through the window blinds. I squeezed the edges together. A faint separation appeared along the inner fold. The paper was double-layered. There was a hidden compartment crafted directly into the lining of the envelope itself. My heart resumed its rapid cadence. The game was not over. My thumb traced the rigid edge of the cream parchment. The ambient light from the street lamps outside caught a faint seam hidden along the bottom fold of the envelope. I reached across my desk and picked up a steel letter opener. I slid the sharp tip under the corner of the heavy cardstock. I applied a slow, steady pressure. The thick paper yielded with a soft tearing sound, splitting the envelope down the center. The structure was a masterclass in deception. The outer layer was designed to hold the brass key and the vintage letterhead, providing a satisfying discovery meant to stop any further investigation. But nested within the lining was a second compartment. I reached inside and withdrew a single piece of folded paper. It was a stock certificate. The document was printed on heavy archival stock bordered by intricate green and gold filigree. The ink was slightly faded, carrying the distinct texture of a traditional press. I flattened the certificate on my desk and read the center text. The document certified the ownership of 6% of Class A voting shares in Miller Corporate. My breath caught in my throat. 5% was the threshold required to activate the poison pill protocol. My father had left me 6. I looked at the date stamped in the lower right corner, 1995. It was the year I was born. I moved my eyes to the designated shareholder line. My name was not printed there. Instead, the shares were registered to a holding entity called the Hastings Blind Trust. Hastings was my mother's maiden name. The architecture of my father's strategy suddenly snapped into focus, illuminating the dark corners of my family history. Earlier today, in the humid air of the Pacific Heights sunroom, Patricia confessed her great victory. She admitted she convinced my father to alter his succession plan 5 years ago, manipulating him into leaving the entire visible empire to Nathan. She thought she had won. She thought she had secured the golden child's future by reshaping the public will. But Patricia only changed the public narrative. Decades ago, on the year I was born, Richard Miller quietly carved out a 6% slice of the most powerful equity in the company. He legally separated these shares from the main estate. He placed them in a blind trust using my mother's maiden name, effectively shielding the asset from any standard internal audit looking for the Miller surname. The trust was entirely invisible to probate court, to Chairman David Sterling, to Nathan, and most importantly, to Patricia herself. The brilliance of the timing left me speechless. If my father had simply handed me these shares while he was alive, Sterling would have recognized the threat immediately. The board would have spent years attempting to dilute my voting power or force a buyout. Instead, my father buried the weapon in the foundation of the company. The trust was legally structured to remain dormant, designed to trigger only upon his death and the official reading of the primary will. He ensured I only received the weapon when the war actually began. I was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of my own legacy. I possessed the legal standing to walk into the boardroom on Monday morning. I had the power to slam the emergency brake on the San Jose Tech campus liquidation. I could freeze the Vanguard Apex transaction and trigger a federal audit that would unravel Sterling's entire criminal network. I picked up the certificate, feeling the raised seal under my fingertips. The exhaustion that had weighed me down just moments ago evaporated, replaced by a surge of cold, focused adrenaline. I turned the document over to inspect the endorsement section on the back. A block of fine legal print covered the lower half of the page. I read the text carefully. My momentum hit a sudden, jarring obstacle. The shares were dormant. Because the trust had been administered through a proxy for nearly 3 decades, transferring the voting rights directly to my name, for an emergency injunction required a specific verification protocol. To prevent corporate fraud, the bylaws demanded a physical counter-signature. I needed a currently seated board member in good standing to witness my signature and verify my identity as the beneficiary. A new daunting conflict materialized in front of me. Having the weapon was useless if I could not disable the safety catch. I needed a board member to sign the document before the Monday morning meeting. The problem was the composition of the board itself. Chairman Sterling had spent the last 5 years carefully pruning the directors. He ousted anyone loyal to my father and replaced them with hand-picked allies, individuals who prioritized their own stock portfolios over the health of the company. They were a unified front of predators. If I approached any of Sterling's loyalists with this certificate, they would immediately alert the chairman. Sterling would deploy his legal team to file a temporary restraining order, tying the certificate up in litigation until the San Jose sale finalized. I needed to find a crack in their armor. I needed a director who possessed the authority to sign, but harbored enough resentment to betray the chairman. I opened my laptop and woke the screens. I accessed the Miller Corporate Internal Directory and pulled up the profiles of the 12 seated board members. I bypassed the biographies and went straight to the voting records and committee assignments from the past 2 years. People rarely broadcast their disloyalty, but their grievances are always documented in the margins. I was looking for a pattern of marginalization. I scanned the quarterly meeting minutes tracking the shifting power dynamics. 3 names stood out, but 2 of them had recently accepted lucrative consulting contracts from Sterling's holding companies. Their loyalty was bought and paid for. That left 1 name, Marcus Davis. I pulled up his detailed dossier. Marcus Davis was a veteran real estate developer. He was 68 years old, a contemporary of my father, who had built his fortune developing commercial high-rises in downtown San Francisco. He had served on the Miller board for 15 years. I cross-referenced his voting history. 18 months ago, Marcus held the chairmanship of the Executive Compensation Committee. It was a position of significant influence. Then the voting pattern shifted. Sterling initiated a subtle campaign to consolidate power. The minutes showed Sterling routinely interrupting Marcus during presentations. Sterling introduced motions to bypass the Compensation Committee entirely, rendering Marcus irrelevant. 6 months ago, Sterling orchestrated a silent coup. He called a sudden vote during a session Marcus was unable to attend. The board stripped Marcus of his committee chairmanship, handing it to a younger, more compliant director. Marcus Davis was not just a board member. He was a proud, old-school developer whose ego had been publicly bruised by a younger, arrogant chairman. Sterling had pushed him to the absolute edge of the inner circle, leaving him sidelined and bleeding influence. Marcus was still a seated director, which meant his signature carried full legal weight, but his loyalty to Sterling was non-existent. He was the weak link. He was my target. I opened a secondary search window utilizing a real estate database to locate his primary residence. Marcus owned a sprawling mid-century property in the Seacliff neighborhood overlooking the Pacific Ocean. I checked his recent public appearances. He was an avid runner, frequently photographed participating in early morning charity races along the coastal trails. I glanced at the clock on my monitor. It was nearly 5 in the morning. The sun would rise in just over an hour. Sunday morning was slipping away. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I walked to my closet and pulled out a tailored charcoal suit, the kind of armor required for corporate warfare. I dressed quickly, my mind running through the variables of the upcoming confrontation. I could not appeal to Marcus Davis using emotion or nostalgia for my father. Men like Marcus did not survive 4 decades in commercial real estate by being sentimental. They survived by calculating risk and reward. I needed to show him that Sterling was a sinking ship, and I was the only lifeboat available. I walked back to my desk and carefully placed the 1995 stock certificate into a hard plastic sleeve. I slid the sleeve into my leather briefcase. I printed the shadow ledger documents linking Sterling to the Vanguard Apex Shell Company. I added those files to the briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. I grabbed my car keys from the kitchen counter. The apartment was entirely silent. The ticking clock in my head was the only sound I heard. I had 30 hours before Nathan signed the liquidation papers. I had to secure the counter signature, fracture the unity of a billionaire board, and position myself for the final strike. I walked out of my apartment and locked the door behind me, heading out into the dark San Francisco morning to hunt a predator. The marine layer off the Pacific Ocean was thick, tasting of salt and chilled asphalt. I leaned against the quarter panel of my sedan near the Land's End Trail. It was 6 in the morning. The coastal fog obscured the Golden Gate Bridge, reducing the world to a radius of 50 feet. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my breath forming pale clouds in the freezing air. I did not shiver. My focus was locked on the gravel path winding up from the beach. Marcus Davis maintained a strict routine. His public fitness tracking profile showed a daily 5-mile run starting at dawn. At precisely 10 minutes past 6, the rhythmic crunch of running shoes on gravel broke the morning quiet. Marcus emerged from the mist. He wore a breathable performance jacket and dark running tights. For a man approaching 70, his pace was punishing. He kept his eyes fixed forward, a wealthy developer accustomed to owning whatever path he traveled. I stepped away from the car, positioning myself directly in the center of the trail. Marcus frowned, breaking his stride. He recognized me as the distance closed. His expression shifted from mild surprise to deep irritation. I was the displaced daughter, the outcast. He raised a hand, gesturing for me to move aside without slowing his momentum. Alice, Marcus said, his breathing steady. "This is a private trail. Call my assistant if you want an appointment." I did not move. He was forced to halt a mere 3 feet away, his chest heaving slightly. "David Sterling is liquidating the San Jose Tech campus tomorrow morning," I said. "He is selling it to a shadow entity called Vanguard Apex." Marcus wiped a line of sweat from his brow, his irritation turning into a scowl. "Your brother is selling the campus. Sterling is merely advising. If you have an issue with the family trust, take it up with your mother. Step aside." Vanguard Apex is a shell company, I continued, my tone unyielding. It traces back to an offshore holding account in the British Virgin Islands. The account belongs to Sterling. That made him freeze. Marcus was an old-school predator. He understood real estate, and he understood betrayal. The annoyance drained from his face, replaced by cautious calculation. He looked at me, scanning my face, trying to determine if the disinherited accountant was bluffing. I turned toward the hood of my sedan. I opened my leather briefcase and retrieved a thin electronic tablet. I tapped the screen, bringing up the Shadow Ledger data files I had decrypted hours earlier. I laid the device flat against the cold metal of the car. "Look at the routing numbers," I commanded. Marcus hesitated, pride warring with self-preservation. Self-preservation won. He stepped closer to the vehicle, leaning over the screen. I swiped through the documents, presenting the offshore registry leaks, the Delaware Incorporation papers, and the hidden trust ownership forms. I watched his eyes track the data. A vein pulsed near his temple. "Sterling engineered this," I explained, maintaining a clinical cadence. He convinced the board to let Nathan self-destruct. "Tomorrow at 9, Nathan signs the deed over to Vanguard Apex at a severe discount. Your chairman is stealing a billion-dollar asset right out from under the entire board. He is transferring the equity into his own pocket." I pulled up the secondary spreadsheet. This was the document I had generated during the drive over, analyzing the financial fallout. I pointed to a specific column. When the San Jose property leaves the portfolio, the baseline corporate valuation drops. Your personal stock options, the ones you have spent 15 years accumulating, are tied to that baseline. Once Sterling finalizes this theft, he will announce the loss. The stock will plummet. Your options will dilute into worthlessness. Marcus stared at the numbers. His jaw tightened. He had spent the last 18 months being marginalized, by Sterling stripped of his committee chairmanship and pushed to the periphery of the boardroom. Now he realized the humiliation was not just political, it was financial. Sterling had sidelined him to ensure he would not notice his own pockets being picked. "Sterling is burning the house down to collect the insurance," I said. "He is going to let you burn with it." "Why are you showing me this?" Marcus demanded, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "If you take this to the Securities and Exchange Commission, Sterling goes to prison. The board gets suspended. It does not help you." "Federal investigations take years," I replied. "By the time the government issues a subpoena, the asset is gone and the money is washed. I am not going to wait for the authorities. I am going to freeze the sale tomorrow morning." I reached into my briefcase a second time. I pulled out the rigid plastic sleeve containing the heavy parchment. I withdrew the faded 1995 stock certificate and placed it next to the tablet on the hood of the car. Marcus picked up the document. His eyes widened as he read the green and gold filigree. He saw the 6% allocation. He saw the blind trust registration. He realized my father had outmaneuvered everyone from the grave. "I have the standing to trigger the poison pill protocol," I stated. "I can enact a permanent injunction against the liquidation." But because the shares were held in a proxy trust, the corporate bylaws require a verification signature from a currently seated director. I need a counter signature to activate the equity. I pulled a silver pen from my pocket and held it out. Sign my certificate, and I will walk into the boardroom and stop the transaction. You keep your wealth, I keep my father's company. Marcus weighed the pen in his hand. He was not signing out of loyalty to Richard Miller. He was not signing out of pity for me. He was signing to protect his own fortune and to exact vengeance on the man who had humiliated him. It was a strictly transactional alliance, forged in the cold morning fog. He produced his own pen from the inner pocket of his running jacket, a heavy gold implement. He bent over the hood of the sedan, the gold nib scratched against the vintage paper, leaving a bold, looping signature on the endorsement line. He dated it, adding his official director identification number beneath his name. He stood up, handing the certificate back to me. "Sterling is a cornered animal," Alice Marcus warned, zipping his jacket. "If you walk into that room and back him against a wall, he will try to destroy you. You better not miss." "I am an accountant, Marcus," I replied, sliding the endorsed document back into its protective sleeve. "I never miss a decimal." Marcus turned and jogged back into the mist, his footsteps fading into the rhythmic sound of the crashing waves below. I was alone again, but the dynamic had shifted. The monolithic unity of the Miller corporate board was officially fractured. I held the activated key. The narrative accelerated. The weekend dissolved into a blur of preparation. The sun rose on Monday morning, burning away the marine layer and casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the glass facades of the financial district. I steered my sedan through the morning traffic, heading straight for the Miller corporate tower. The city moved around me, millions of people commuting to ordinary jobs, unaware of the corporate warfare about to unfold 50 stories above them. My briefcase rested on the passenger seat. The 6% share certificate was tucked safely inside, waiting like a loaded weapon. Securing the signature was only the preliminary skirmish. Now I had to face the true battleground. I was driving toward a room filled with powerful men who believed they were untouchable. I had to bypass corporate security. I had to confront my brother, a man drowning in his own ego. I had to look David Sterling in the eye and tear down his empire before he could deploy his legal team. I turned into the underground parking garage, pulling into a visitor space. The engine cut out, leaving a ringing silence in the cabin. I picked up the briefcase. The leather handle felt cool and solid in my grip. The element of surprise was my only shield, and once I pushed open those boardroom doors, the safety catch would be off. The clock struck 8:45. It was time to audit the board. The elevator doors glided open on the 52nd floor. The digital clock on the reception wall read 8:58 in the morning. I walked past the empty administration desk. My leather briefcase hung heavy in my hand. I pushed through the frosted glass doors of the Miller corporate boardroom, shattering the predatory silence inside. The 12 directors of the Miller board sat frozen in their high-backed leather chairs. Nathan stared at the crimson folder resting inches from his silver pen. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. He reached for the intercom console built into the table. "Security," Nathan demanded, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "We have an unauthorized person in the room. Escort her out immediately." I did not break my stride. I walked down the length of the mahogany floorboards and took the single empty chair at the opposite end of the long glass table. Chairman David Sterling sat to Nathan's right. Sterling smoothed the lapels of his tailored navy suit. He projected the calm authority of a man who believed he owned the room and everyone in it. "Turn off the intercom," Nathan Sterling instructed quietly. He offered me a patronizing smile. "Alice, we are in the middle of a closed corporate session. I understand you are grieving. The reading of the will was a difficult adjustment for you, but you are not a shareholder. You have no legal standing to interrupt this proceeding. Please leave before you embarrass yourself further." I ignored my brother entirely. I kept my gaze locked on the chairman. I unlatched my briefcase. The brass locks opened with a sharp, decisive click. I withdrew the rigid plastic sleeve and pulled out the faded stock certificate. I placed it flat on the glass surface and slid it forward. It glided down the center of the table, coming to a halt directly in front of Sterling. As a Class A shareholder, I said, my voice carrying clear and cold across the room, I am enacting an immediate freeze on all legacy asset transfers. Sterling looked down at the document. He recognized the heavy archival paper and the green and gold filigree. His eyes tracked across the 1995 date stamp, the Hastings Blind Trust registration, and finally rested on the bottom corner. Marcus Davis sat 3 seats away from the chairman. Marcus did not flinch. He did not look away. He let Sterling read his fresh, bold signature, validating my equity. The patronizing smile vanished from Sterling's face. The skin around his eyes tightened. He realized the monolithic unity of his boardroom had just been fractured. He looked at Marcus, calculating the depth of the betrayal, then turned his attention back to me. This is an antique document, Sterling sneered, dismissing the paper with a wave of his hand. It holds no procedural weight. Furthermore, Nathan is the sitting Chief Executive Officer. Under Section 4 of the Corporate Bylaws, the Executive Office retains emergency override authority to liquidate assets to preserve company liquidity. The margin call threatens the operational stability of this firm. He is signing the San Jose deed to save us. Your little freeze is overruled. I opened the crimson folder. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I had the ledger. Nathan is not saving the firm, I replied. He is plugging a personal debt hole. And you are holding the shovel. I extracted 12 stapled packets from the folder. I passed them to the directors seated near me, instructing them to distribute the copies around the table. The rustle of paper filled the silence. I watched the expressions of the board members shift as they turned the pages. They were wealthy, self-interested individuals. They only cared about their own portfolios. I was about to show them who was really stealing their money. Page 1 details the Vanguard Apex Incorporation structure I explained, pacing my words to let the data sink into their minds. It is a shell company operating out of New York. The entity purchasing our tech campus at a severe market discount is not an independent equity firm. It is a subsidiary. Sterling shifted in his chair. He reached for his packet, but his hand hovered over the paper. Turn to page 3, I instructed the room. You will find the tax identification routing paths. Vanguard Apex traces directly back to an offshore trust registered in the British Virgin Islands. That trust is the sole beneficiary of the discounted tech campus. That trust belongs to Chairman David Sterling. A low murmur rippled through the boardroom. The directors looked from the documents to Sterling, their eyes widening in genuine alarm. You engineered Nathan's failure. I continued, keeping my eyes fixed on the chairman. You encouraged him to over-leverage his personal accounts. You knew he would panic. You structured this fire sale to look like a desperate executive decision, allowing you to bypass federal oversight and pocket a flagship property for pennies. You are stealing from the shareholders. You are stealing from the people sitting in this very room. This is fabricated nonsense, Sterling shouted. He slammed his hand flat against the glass table. She hacked the network. These documents are forged. Security! I stepped forward, resting my hands on the back of my leather chair. If you call security, David, the next call I make is to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I have the digital footprints. I have the offshore banking ledgers. The evidence in front of you represents 3 minutes of surgical proof detailing federal wire fraud, self-dealing, and racketeering. I turned my attention to the rest of the board. The directors were already leaning away from Sterling, physically distancing themselves from a sinking ship. In the world of high finance, loyalty evaporates the moment an indictment is mentioned. If any of you vote to authorize this sale, I warned them, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register, you are legally binding yourselves to a criminal conspiracy. The Department of Justice will freeze your personal accounts by Wednesday. They will subpoena your private communications. You will lose everything. The only way to survive this morning is to reject the sale and accept my injunction." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved to touch their pens. No one reached for the intercom. The board realized they were cornered. They had spent years manipulating my father, squeezing the company for marginal gains. But they had never faced an apex predator. They had never faced someone willing to detonate the entire room to save the foundation. I looked at Nathan. My brother sat frozen at the head of the table. The silver pen had slipped from his fingers, rolling harmlessly across the glass. The color had drained from his face. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly open. I could see the horrifying realization dawning behind his eyes. For his entire life, Nathan believed he was the chosen son. He believed our father favored him, groomed him, and trusted him to lead the empire. He thought the public will was the ultimate validation of his superiority. Now, looking at the faded stock certificate and the forensic trap I had just sprung, the truth crashed down on him. Our father never trusted him with the company. Richard Miller knew Nathan was arrogant and weak. He knew the board would circle him like sharks. Our father had intentionally left Nathan as disposable bait. He used his own son to draw the traitors out into the open, trusting me to operate in the shadows. He trusted me to build the case, secure the equity, and execute the kill shot. Nathan was not the king. He was just the pawn our father sacrificed to win the game. The illusion of the golden child shattered on the boardroom floor. Nathan lowered his head, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes. The breath shuddered out of his lungs in a long, defeated exhale. He had nothing left. No money, no power, no pride. I turned back to the remaining directors. The shift in power was complete. I owned the room. "The San Jose Tech campus is no longer for sale," I announced. "This meeting is adjourned." The board members did not wait for Sterling to dismiss them. They stood up in a hurried, uncoordinated rush. Chairs scraped against the floorboards. They gathered their briefcases and filed out of the double doors, desperate to contact their personal defense attorneys. They wanted no part of the fallout. They wanted to be as far away from David Sterling as possible when the authorities arrived. Within 60 seconds, the crowded boardroom emptied. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing the room. Only 3 people remained. I stood at the far end of the long table. Nathan sat slumped at the head, a broken man, staring at his own hands. And Chairman David Sterling remained in his seat, his face dark with suppressed rage. The corporate coup was successful. I had saved the real estate portfolio and neutralized the board. But a new, unexpected conflict was about to emerge from the quiet ruins of the meeting. As Sterling slowly rose to his feet, preparing to launch his counterattack, I noticed something I'd missed during the chaos. A small sensory detail that shifted the entire landscape of my father's death. The endgame was just beginning. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing the 3 of us inside the soundproof walls of the boardroom. The space felt like a corporate graveyard. Abandoned leather briefcases rested against chair legs. Half-empty coffee cups sat next to discarded legal pads. The monolithic unity of the Miller board was shattered, leaving only silence in its wake. Nathan remained slumped at the head of the long glass table. He did not move. He was a statue carved from sudden defeat. But Chairman David Sterling was not a man who accepted loss gracefully. Men who spend their lives hiding wealth in offshore accounts and proxy servers believe they are untouchable. Sterling pushed his chair back. The wheels scraped a harsh, grating sound against the hardwood floor. He stood tall, adjusting the lapels of his navy suit, attempting to reassemble the shattered pieces of his authority. He had spent his entire career insulating himself from consequence. I had just handed him a map of his own execution, and his initial shock was rapidly curdling into malice. He began walking down the length of the table. His steps were slow and measured. It was a classic intimidation tactic. He was trying to reclaim the physical territory of the room, using his height and his gender to force a submission. "You think you have won," Sterling said. His voice was a low rumble, entirely devoid of its usual polished charm. You think a dusty antique stock certificate gives you the keys to the kingdom? You are a naive girl playing a game designed for ruthless adults. I remained seated in my high-backed leather chair. I did not shrink away as he closed the distance. "The financial documents speak for themselves, David," I replied smoothly. "Your shell company is exposed. Documents can be tied up in litigation for a decade," he countered. He stopped beside my chair. He planted both hands flat against the glass surface, leaning over me. He was trying to cast a shadow over my workspace, invading my personal zone. "I will file injunctions in federal court before the market closes today," Sterling threatened. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "I will claim your father was experiencing severe cognitive decline when he established that blind trust. I will drown you in so many legal fees you will be forced to sell your shares just to pay your attorneys. I have a war chest of $50 million designated solely for litigation. You will never sit in that executive chair, Alice. You will spend the rest of your life in depositions." He was so close, I could hear the faint, rapid hitch in his breathing. He was terrified. He was masking his panic with a barrage of legal threats. Then the air between us shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint note catching in my throat as I drew a breath. As Sterling leaned closer, the heat radiating from his skin carried a distinct, heavy aroma. I inhaled slowly. My forensic training kicked in immediately, categorizing the sensory input with the exact same cold precision I used to analyze tax returns. Top notes of clove, a rich, heavy base of sandalwood. My pulse stalled. The ambient noise of the city traffic outside the thick windows faded into a distant, ringing hum. My father imported his cologne from a bespoke private perfumer in Paris. It was a proprietary blend created specifically for him 30 years ago. The perfumer never sold the formula to anyone else in the world. It was an unmistakable, singular signature. It was the exact scent that lingered on the vintage letterhead tucked inside the wax-sealed envelope Jonathan had given me. Sterling did not wear this scent. Sterling wore a sharp, generic citrus aftershave. I had smelled it a dozen times during previous quarterly shareholder meetings. But today, right now, the heavy aroma of my father's custom sandalwood radiated from the fabric of Sterling's tailored suit. Cologne does not transfer through a casual corporate handshake. It transfers through prolonged, intimate contact. Or it transfers when a man stands in a closed, poorly ventilated room where the scent is deeply embedded into the leather furniture, the heavy velvet drapes, and the wool rugs. A room exactly like my father's private study at the Pacific Heights estate. My father died of a sudden heart attack late at night. The medical examiner ruled it natural causes due to a documented history of hypertension. There was no autopsy performed. There was no police investigation. My mother had the body cremated within 48 hours to avoid a public spectacle and maintain the pristine family image. The puzzle pieces rearranged themselves in my mind with terrifying, absolute clarity. The financial audit was just the outer layer of the labyrinth, the shadow ledger, the poison pill protocol, the hidden trust. My father had not just built a defense against corporate theft, he had anticipated a physical threat. He knew Sterling was cornered. He knew Sterling would resort to desperate, fatal measures to secure the San Jose Tech campus before the rest of the board lost their nerve. I looked up at Sterling. The anger burning in his eyes was hollow. It was the fragile bravado of a man who thought he had successfully buried his worst sins. "You were in his private study the night he died," I said. I did not shout. I dropped my voice to a quiet, even register. The words hit the air like drops of freezing water. Sterling froze. His hands still braced against the glass table twitched involuntarily. The color drained from his face with alarming speed. The blood vanished from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. "You were at the house." I continued, holding his gaze without blinking. He kept the cologne bottle on his mahogany desk. "You were close enough to him, or close enough to his belongings, to carry the scent away on your clothes. My father did not have a random heart attack. You forced it. You killed him." Sterling opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The polished, untouchable billionaire vanished. He was replaced by a terrified suspect staring at the detective who just found the murder weapon. He realized in that split second that I was no longer just auditing his offshore accounts. I was auditing a homicide. "That is insane," Sterling stammered. His voice was breathless, lacking any trace of his former intimidation. "You have no proof. You are hysterical." "I am a forensic accountant, David. I follow the trail. If you were in that study, you left a digital footprint, a gated community security log, a cell tower ping, a toll plaza camera. I am going to subpoena every byte of data transmitted in Pacific Heights on the night of the 14th. I am going to find your footprint. And when I do, you will not be worrying about Securities and Exchange Commission fines or shareholder lawsuits. You will be worrying about a life sentence." Sterling pushed himself away from the table. He stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the hardwood floor. He looked at the door, then back at me, his eyes wide with genuine, unrestrained panic. He did not attempt another legal threat. He did not try to reclaim his authority. He turned and fled. He practically ran down the length of the boardroom, pushing through the heavy glass doors and disappearing into the hallway. The latch clicked shut, leaving the room in profound stillness. I sat in the silence, letting the reality of my father's death settle deep into my bones. He was murdered. The man who taught me how to read leads and calculate risk had been taken from me by a parasite in a tailored suit. A cold, hardened resolve locked into place within my chest. Sterling's financial ruin was no longer sufficient. I was going to dismantle his life. I was going to build a cage of evidence so tight he would never see the outside of a federal penitentiary. But to do that, I needed total, undisputed control of the corporation. I needed immediate access to the executive security protocols, the legal war chests, and the internal corporate communications. I could not fight a complex murder trial while simultaneously fighting a proxy war for the chief executive chair. I turned my head. Nathan was still sitting at the far end of the table. My older brother had not moved during my confrontation with Sterling. He had been a silent spectator to his own downfall, watching the chairman he trusted transform into a suspected killer. Nathan looked small. The bespoke jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, framing a hollow man. His pristine silver pen lay discarded on the glass, a symbol of the authority he never truly possessed. I stood up, picking up my crimson folder. I walked the length of the table, my heels echoing in the quiet room. I stopped near his chair. Nathan looked up at me. His eyes were red-rimmed with the deep exhaustion of a man whose entire worldview had been shattered in less than an hour. He expected me to deliver the final blow. He expected me to fire him, to call security to humiliate him the way he had tried to humiliate me at the Beverly Hills Gala. He was waiting for his execution. "I am ruined," Nathan whispered. His voice was a raspy, broken sound. "Sterling owns my margin debt. If the sale does not go through, Vanguard Apex will seize my personal assets by Friday. My house, my cars, Jessica's trusts, everything. I am bankrupt, Alice. You won. You can throw me out now." I looked down at the golden child. My mother had sacrificed my future to protect his fragile ego. My father had used him as bait to draw out a murderer. For 31 years, Nathan had been the center of the Miller family universe. Now, he was just a liability waiting to be discarded. The ultimate climax of this corporate war did not hinge on defeating David Sterling. Sterling was a target. The true test of my power rested on the choice I was about to make regarding my own blood. I held his entire life in my hands. I could destroy him with a single signature. I could leave him to the wolves. But revenge is an emotional luxury, and forensic accountants do not trade in emotion. We trade in leverage. I placed the crimson folder on the table. I looked at my brother, analyzing his despair, calculating exactly how to restructure his future. It was time to show Nathan what real authority looked like. I looked down at the golden child. Nathan sat in the leather chair waiting for the executioner to swing the axe. He expected me to call the building security team. He expected me to strip him of his title, cancel his access cards, and throw him out onto the San Francisco pavement. That is what he would have done to me. But revenge is an emotional luxury, and forensic accountants do not trade in emotion. We trade in leverage. I am not going to fire you, Nathan, I said. His head snapped up. His red-rimmed eyes searched my face, looking for the trap. He braced his hands against the armrests. "What do you mean?" he rasped. I walked around the edge of the glass table, closing the distance between us. I pulled out the chair to his left and sat down. For the first time in my life, I was looking at my older brother, not as a rival, but as an asset waiting to be restructured. "You want to be the chief executive officer?" I said, keeping my tone conversational and smooth. "You have spent your entire adult life chasing the validation that comes with the corner office, so you are going to keep the title. You will remain the public face of Miller Corporate. You will attend the charity galas in Beverly Hills. You will cut the ribbons at our new commercial developments. You will smile for the financial press and shake hands with the mayor." Nathan stared at me, a flicker of hope ignited behind his eyes. He thought I was offering a truce. He thought the natural order of our family was reasserting itself. When he wrecked his first sports car at age 19, our father bought him a replacement vehicle to keep the police report out of the local papers. When his virtual reality startup collapsed 2 years ago, our mother quietly funneled trust capital to pay off the angry investors. He had lived 3 decades believing that a safety net would always materialize to catch him. He thought I was his new safety net. "I appreciate that, Alice," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its former polish. "We can run the portfolio together. We can present a unified front to the shareholders." I held up a hand, stopping his sentence in its tracks. "You misunderstand the new architecture of this firm," I clarified. "You will hold the title, but you will never sign a check, authorize a wire transfer, or approve a vendor contract without my explicit written authorization. You will have 0 operational authority. You are a figurehead." The hope vanished from his expression, replaced by a sudden, frantic panic. "You cannot do that," he argued, leaning forward. "I have a $50 million margin call hanging over my head. Vanguard Apex expects their capital by Friday. If I do not have operational control, they will seize my personal holdings. They will take the Pacific Palisades estate. They will take the cars. Jessica will lose her discretionary trusts. We will be bankrupt." I opened my crimson folder again. I had spent Sunday night drafting a series of documents anticipating this exact intersection of greed and desperation. I extracted a thick stack of legal contracts bound by a heavy silver clip. I slid the paperwork across the glass table. "Miller Corporate is going to absorb your margin debt," I stated. Nathan looked at the stack of paper, then back at me. He was struggling to process the rapid shifts in his reality. "You are paying off Vanguard Apex," he asked. "I am settling the ledger to protect the company," I corrected him. "I cannot allow David Sterling to hold a blade to the throat of this corporation. I am neutralizing the threat. The firm will clear your debt by the end of the business day." Nathan exhaled a long, shaking breath. He slumped back into his chair. The immediate threat of financial ruin lifted from his shoulders. "Thank you," he whispered. "Pick up the pen," I said. He blinked, confused by the sudden command. He reached across the glass and picked up the silver Mont Blanc pen he had dropped earlier. "Turn to the 3rd page," I instructed. Nathan flipped open the contract. His eyes scanned the dense legal typography. As he read the clauses, the blood drained from his face. His hand began to tremble. The silver pen rattled softly against the glass table. "This is a cross-collateralization agreement," Nathan said. His voice was hollow. "It is a margin call guarantee," I confirmed. "You accrued a reckless, catastrophic debt to fund a vanity project. The company is stepping in to pay your creditors. In exchange, you are going to personally guarantee the new internal credit line we are extending to you." He shook his head, staring at the paper in horror. "You are tying my personal assets to the firm. I am tying your obedience to your survival," I corrected. Read the asset schedule attached to Appendix A. To secure this internal loan, you are pledging the deed to the Pacific Palisades estate. You are pledging the titles to your luxury vehicle fleet. You are pledging the principal balance of Jessica's discretionary trusts. They no longer belong to you. They belong to Miller Corporate. They are collateral. You cannot do this to Jessica, he pleaded, his voice rising in pitch. She will leave me. Her family will destroy me in the press. Jessica married a chief executive, I replied coldly. She can stay married to one. But if you step out of line, if you attempt to bypass my authority, or if you ever try to leverage a company asset again, I will execute this guarantee. I will foreclose on your home. I will seize the trusts. I will leave you both with nothing but the clothes on your backs. It was pure, unadulterated, poetic justice. Less than an hour ago, Nathan sat in this exact chair, preparing to sign away our father's legacy to save his own skin. Now, I was forcing him to sign the exact same predatory paperwork he tried to use on the company. I was stripping away his autonomy, binding his personal freedom to my mercy. I cannot sign this, Nathan whispered, dropping the pen. It is a death sentence. If you do not sign it, I will walk out of this room, I replied. I will let Vanguard Apex initiate the seizure of your assets by Friday morning. They will not be polite. They will lock you out of your house before dinner. He stared at me. He searched my eyes for any trace of sisterly affection, any lingering loyalty to the family dynamic our mother had carefully curated. He found a forensic accountant looking at a balanced ledger. The silence stretched across the boardroom. The air felt thin and cold. Nathan looked at the frosted glass doors, realizing there was no one left to save him. The board of directors had abandoned him. David Sterling had used him and fled. Our mother was miles away pruning her bonsai trees, entirely unaware that her golden child had just been caught in a trap. Nathan picked up the silver pen. His hand shook. The metal nib hovered over the signature line. He pressed down, the ink bleeding into the heavy paper. He signed his name on the primary guarantee. He flipped the page, his breathing ragged, and initialed the asset forfeiture clauses. He signed away his home. He signed away his cars. He signed away his wife's financial security. With every stroke of the pen, the transfer of power solidified. He was no longer the arrogant heir apparent who mocked me at the Beverly Hills charity gala. He was a prisoner locked inside a gilded cage. He would wear the custom suits and drink the expensive champagne, but he would jump whenever I pulled the leash. He finished the final signature. He pushed the stack of contracts back across the table. He did not look at me. He stared blankly at the polished mahogany floorboards. I collected the paperwork. I checked each page, verifying the signatures and the dates. The ink was dark and binding. The legal architecture was flawless. I placed the contracts into my crimson folder. I picked up my leather briefcase and stood up from the table. I had walked into this room as a disinherited ghost. I was walking out with absolute systemic control of a California real estate empire. And I had achieved it without raising my voice. Be in your office at 8 tomorrow morning, Nathan, I said. We have a lot of restructuring to do. I turned and walked toward the boardroom doors. The sound of my heels echoed in the quiet space, a steady rhythm replacing the chaos of the morning. The corporate war for the portfolio was over. The assets were secure. But as I pushed through the frosted glass and stepped back into the executive reception area, a new challenge waited for me. The elevator doors chimed at the end of the hallway. The polished steel panels slid apart. My mother stepped onto the 52nd floor. Patricia wore a pristine ivory suit, carrying a delicate pastry box tied with a silk ribbon. She looked around the empty reception area, her serene smile faltering as she noticed the absence of the board members. She had come to celebrate the finalization of Nathan's coronation. She had come to watch her stunted, carefully pruned family dynamic take permanent root in the corporate soil. She had no idea the garden had just been burned to the ground. 7 days had passed since the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung shut on the reign of David Sterling. The power dynamic within California high society shifted with a quiet, undeniable finality. The tremor started in the financial district and rippled outward through the country clubs and charity galas. Rumors circulated about early retirements and sudden structural reorganizations. No one knew the exact details of the corporate execution, but everyone understood the result. The golden child had been dethroned. The forgotten daughter held the keys to the kingdom. I sat behind the sprawling oak desk in the chief executive suite on the 52nd floor. The desk previously belonged to my father. It was a formidable piece of vintage woodwork, unvarnished and practical, bearing the faint scratches of decades of intense labor. I did not redecorate the corner office. I did not order new imported leather chairs or replace the artwork. I simply directed the maintenance staff to remove Nathan's golf trophies from the display shelves and place them in a cardboard box. The room smelled of polished wood and cold, filtered air conditioning. From the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, the San Francisco skyline stretched out beneath me, a grid of concrete and glass blanketed by a thin layer of morning fog. I held the reins of a $400 million real estate portfolio. My older brother sat 3 doors down in a windowless administrative space, reviewing minor vendor contracts he was no longer legally permitted to sign. The transition of authority was seamless and ruthless. The digital clock on my terminal read 1:45 in the afternoon. The heavy oak doors clicked open. My executive assistant did not announce the visitor over the intercom. My mother walked into the room uninvited. Patricia wore a pristine ivory suit, the exact shade of expensive neutrality she favored for high-profile luncheon committees. Yet the effortless grace she usually projected was strikingly absent. Her steps were hesitant, lacking their usual sharp, commanding cadence. She carried a small, cream-colored box tied with a sage-green silk ribbon. The logo belonged to an artisanal boutique bakery in Pacific Heights. She stopped a few feet away from the edge of the sprawling desk. The silence in the spacious office stretched out thick and uncomfortable. I did not stand up to greet her. I did not offer her a seat in the guest chairs. I kept my hands folded neatly over the quarterly financial reports, resting on my leather blotting pad. "Alice," she said. Her voice was thin, carrying a fragile tremor she could not quite suppress. "I thought I would stop by the tower. I brought those almond pastries you used to like when you were young." I looked at the boutique box. I have not eaten almond pastries in 15 years. The gesture was hollow, a desperate attempt to bridge a psychological canyon she had spent my entire life digging. She set the box on the corner of the oak desk. Her hands were visibly shaking. The steady, precise fingers that had ruthlessly pruned the Japanese juniper tree just over a week ago were now trembling under the crushing weight of her own irrelevance. She offered a nervous, tight smile, the corners of her mouth strained against the effort, forming a mask of forced warmth. "I want you to know how proud I am," Patricia continued. She smoothed the front of her ivory jacket, seeking a familiar physical comfort. "I always knew you had the strength to handle the business, Alice. Your father and I always knew. We just needed you to prove it. We needed to push you so you would step up and claim your potential." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. She was attempting to rewrite history in real time. She was trying to reframe decades of emotional erasure, neglect, and systemic abandonment as a calculated parenting strategy. She wanted to take credit for the steel in my spine. She wanted to pretend the humiliating public will was a secret test of character, rather than a deliberate execution of my financial future to protect her favored son. A younger version of me would have stood up and shouted. A younger version of me would have demanded a tearful apology, cataloging every missed birthday, every dismissed academic achievement, every single moment she favored Nathan's mediocrity over my dedication. I would have wanted her to cry. I would have wanted her to feel the exact sting of rejection I carried for 31 years. But sitting in my father's chair looking at this fragile woman in her expensive suit, I felt nothing. The burning need for her validation had extinguished. Forensic accountants understand the concept of sunk costs. You cannot recover an investment that was never sound in the first place. My mother was a bad investment. Demanding an apology from someone incapable of genuine, unselfish remorse is a waste of emotional capital. I did not yell. I did not defend my father's true intentions or expose the depth of her manipulation. I simply let the silence hang in the air. I let the quiet atmosphere of the 52nd floor press down on her shoulders. 5 seconds passed, then 10. The silence became a physical entity, heavy and suffocating. Patricia's tight smile faltered. Her eyes darted around the room, searching the walls and the windows for an anchor, but finding only my cold, impenetrable expression. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other. The psychological pressure was dismantling her composure far more effectively than anger ever could. "Thank you, Patricia," I said. My voice was level, carrying the polite, detached tone one uses to dismiss a persistent vendor. "You can leave the box with my assistant on your way out. I have a 2:00 call." Patricia flinched. The use of her first name, rather than a familial title, struck her like a physical blow. She realized in that fraction of a second that her maternal manipulation was entirely useless. The old architecture of our family dynamic was dead. She had lost her power over me forever. She possessed no leverage, no lingering guilt to exploit, no childhood affection to weaponize. I was no longer a daughter seeking approval. I was the chief executive of Miller Corporate, and she was an uninvited guest taking up valuable time on my schedule. She opened her mouth to speak, but the cold finality in my eyes stopped the words in her throat. She swallowed hard, nodding once. Her pristine posture crumpled, slightly defeated by the realization that she was no longer the matriarch of an empire. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Her footsteps were quiet, stripped of their usual aristocratic authority. The doors clicked shut behind her. The narrative tension holding my shoulders rigid finally released. A profound, deep satisfaction settled into my bones. The cycle was broken. I did not need her permission to succeed, and I did not need her apology to heal. I swept the pastry box to the far edge of the desk and turned my attention back to the quarterly reports. The rest of the week blurred into a steady rhythm of corporate triage. I spent the days dismantling the lingering influence of the former chairman, severing vendor contracts linked to his associates, and restructuring the internal compliance departments. By Friday evening, the executive floor was deserted. The sun dipped below the San Francisco skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the office. The building was quiet, leaving only the soft hum of the ventilation system. I poured a glass of cold water and booted up my primary forensic terminal. The immediate threats were neutralized, but the shadow ledger still held encrypted sectors I had not fully processed. I opened the digital journal my father left in the subterranean vault. I began auditing the deepest layers of the data, cross-referencing the offshore accounts Sterling had used to siphon funds. As my algorithms parsed the historical transactions, a glaring anomaly interrupted the data feed. It was a cluster of financial routing numbers listed in the back appendix of the ledger. I frowned, leaning closer to the glowing monitor. These routing numbers did not align with the California real estate portfolio. They did not connect to Nathan's margin debts, and they bore no relation to the fraudulent shell companies I exposed on Monday. The digits formed a pattern pointing to international wire transfers dating back to the late 1980s. I initiated a tracing protocol hunting the remote IP addresses associated with the ghost accounts. The tension in the quiet office instantly spiked. My father had built a puzzle to stop a corporate theft, but this ledger contained something far older and far more dangerous. The numbers were leading me out of California, pointing straight toward an undisclosed financial fortress in Geneva. The war for the Miller Empire was not over. The executive floor of the Miller corporate tower was a tomb of glass and steel. It was Friday evening, long past the hour when the administrative staff abandoned their cubicles for the weekend. The setting sun cast long shadows across my father's oak desk, painting the room in shades of bruised purple and charcoal. The ambient noise of the city had faded into a distant hum. Inside the suite, the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. I was conducting a final sweep of the internal networks. The week had been an exercise in surgical extraction. I systematically purged the board members who enabled the former chairman, replacing them with neutral compliance officers. I restructured the California real estate portfolio, stabilizing the assets Nathan had nearly destroyed. The balance sheets were finally aligning. The immediate corporate war was over, and the company was secure. I took a sip of cold water, letting the chill ground my thoughts. The primary files of the shadow ledger were clean. The evidence against David Sterling was packaged and ready for the federal authorities. I prepared to eject the encrypted USB drive from my terminal. Before executing the command, I noticed a fragmented file path buried at the very bottom of the directory tree. It was an appendix to the digital journal. During the chaos of the boardroom coup, I focused entirely on the recent data pertaining to the Vanguard Apex fraud. I ignored the archived partitions. Forensic accounting demands thoroughness, a refusal to leave any stone unturned. I clicked the obscured file path, running a decryption key to unlock the folder. The screen refreshed, displaying a dense spreadsheet. The grid contained hundreds of alphanumeric routing sequences. My eyes scanned the columns, searching for familiar patterns. The structure was alien. These accounts did not connect to the commercial properties in San Jose or Los Angeles. They bore no relation to Nathan's margin debts or the offshore entities Sterling used to siphon capital. The tax identification numbers defied standard domestic formatting. I leaned closer to the monitor. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark office. I highlighted the date column. The chronological sorting placed the earliest transaction on October 12, 1987. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The timeline contradicted the foundational mythology of the Miller family. According to the narrative my mother repeated at every society dinner, Richard Miller was a struggling independent contractor in the late 1980s. He supposedly drove a rusted pickup truck and worked 18-hour days framing houses in the suburbs, slowly saving enough capital to purchase his first commercial lot a decade later. The California real estate empire was built on sweat equity and humble beginnings. The spreadsheet on my screen destroyed that story. The transactions recorded in 1987 were not small deposits from local construction jobs. They were outgoing wire transfers. The principal amounts were staggering. $5 million here, $8 million there. The ledger documented a continuous outflow of vast liquid wealth, occurring during a period when my father was supposed to be practically penniless. My pulse quickened, drumming a steady beat against my temples. The man who taught me how to read financial statements had constructed a fiction. He manufactured a history to conceal the origin of his wealth. I needed to trace the destination of the money. I opened a command terminal and wrote a custom parsing algorithm. I instructed the software to follow the digital routing numbers, hunting the remote IP addresses associated with the receiving accounts. The program initiated the search, casting a wide net across global banking registries. The wait was agonizing. I watched the progress bar inch forward. The tension in the silent office ramped upward with every passing second. The ghost accounts were heavily shielded, bouncing through proxies in Luxembourg and Cyprus to obscure their final location. My father had employed an architect of financial secrecy, someone who understood how to weave capital through international borders without triggering regulatory alarms. The algorithm finally broke through the last layer of obfuscation. The destination coordinates populated on my right monitor. The IP addresses locked onto a single, fortified financial stronghold. The location was Geneva, Switzerland. The receiving entity was an undisclosed offshore holding firm. It was not a superficial shell company like Vanguard Apex. This was a subterranean fortress designed to house sovereign wealth. Institutions of this caliber do not accept clients holding a few $1,000,000. They require deposits in the billions. They manage the hidden fortunes of foreign dignitaries, exiled royalty, and individuals who operate in the darkest corners of the global economy. I stared at the geographical coordinates. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow driving the breath from my lungs. The $400 million California real estate portfolio was a decoy. It was a brilliant, elaborate facade. My father built the domestic company to serve as a visible distraction. He created a legitimate, highly public empire to keep the Internal Revenue Service occupied. He allowed the greedy board of directors to fight over the scraps of the California properties, keeping their attention fixed on local zoning laws and commercial leases. He gave them a sandbox to play in, ensuring they would never look beyond the horizon. The domestic fortune was merely the tip of the iceberg. Richard Miller possessed an entirely separate existence. He controlled a hidden global fortune of incomprehensible magnitude, safely locked away in the Swiss Alps. He concealed this reality from everyone. The board of directors never knew, Nathan never knew. My mother, who prided herself on manipulating his legacy, was ignorant of his true net worth. He kept the secret isolated. He carried the burden alone until the day his heart stopped beating. I sat back in the heavy oak chair. The leather creaked in the empty suite. I looked around the corner office, viewing the space through a new, terrifying lens. The battles I fought this week suddenly felt remarkably small. I spent the last 7 days dismantling a corrupt chairman and subjugating a reckless brother. I thought I had conquered the mountain. I thought the poison pill protocol and the blind trust represented the pinnacle of my father's strategic genius. I was wrong. The corporate war I just won was not the grand finale. It was an entrance exam. My father did not hand me the vintage letterhead simply to save a tech campus in San Jose. He engineered the boardroom crisis to test my capabilities. He needed to know if I possessed the forensic intellect to uncover a hidden asset. He needed to verify my emotional restraint, ensuring I could execute a ruthless strategy without being blinded by family loyalty or the desire for petty revenge. I had to prove I could handle power before he handed me the keys to the actual kingdom. I had navigated the betrayal. I had neutralized the threats. I had claimed the chief executive chair. The puzzle I solved was just the qualifying round. The real inheritance was waiting in Geneva. A soft chime emanated from the elevator bank down the hall, echoing through the deserted executive floor. The sound shattered the silence of the office, sending a jolt of adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. It was past 9 o'clock on a Friday night. The security protocols locked the elevators at 7. No one was supposed to be able to access this floor without my specific biometric authorization. I closed the shadow ledger files and locked my terminal. I stood up, my eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors of the suite. The sound of measured footsteps approached the entrance. The stride was calm, deliberate, and unbothered by the security breach. The next chapter of my father's hidden life was walking down the corridor, and the true conflict was about to begin. The footsteps stopped outside the heavy oak doors. I remained standing behind the desk, my hand resting near the edge of the keyboard. The executive suite was a secure fortress. The elevators required a biometric scan to access this floor, and the security desk downstairs was instructed to turn away all evening visitors. I had personally restructured the compliance department and updated the access codes just 3 days ago. Yet the brass handle of my office door turned downward with a smooth, oiled click. The heavy panels pushed inward, swinging open into the quiet room. The man who entered did not wear a standard delivery uniform. He was dressed in a fitted charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a high mirror shine. He possessed the quiet, unassuming posture of a professional operative. In his left hand, he carried a small rectangular lockbox constructed of brushed titanium. He had bypassed the floor security, the updated elevator scanners, and the lobby guards without triggering a single alarm. He walked across the room with the measured confidence of someone who operated entirely outside standard corporate boundaries. He stopped 2 feet from the edge of the sprawling oak desk. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask to confirm my identity. He reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a sleek, digital biometric pad. He placed the device on the leather blotting pad in front of me. "Thumbprint," he instructed. His tone was flat, efficient, and devoid of any curiosity. I did not ask questions. I pressed my right thumb against the glowing glass sensor. A green light pulsed twice, confirming the scan. The courier retrieved the device and slid it back into his pocket. He set the titanium lockbox gently on the desk. Without an additional word, he turned and walked back across the room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind him, restoring the isolation of the 52nd floor. I stared at the metal container. The surface was matte, absorbing the dim light radiating from my computer monitors. I reached out and touched the lid. The titanium was cold. A recessed mechanical latch sat flush with the front panel. The biometric scan had evidently transmitted a wireless release signal. I pressed the latch. A series of internal tumblers aligned with a sharp, satisfying snap. The lid lifted back on precise ball bearings. Inside the reinforced chamber rested 3 distinct items. A folded document, printed on heavy archival paper, lay at the bottom. A thick dossier, bound in a black leather cover, sat on top of it. Resting above them both was a third envelope. It matched the exact dimensions of the cream parchment Jonathan had given me inside his legal office. It bore the identical dark red wax seal stamped with the old company crest. Tucked beneath the edge of the envelope was a small piece of personalized stationery. I recognized the sharp-angled handwriting instantly. The blue ink traced the familiar slant of my father's penmanship. I picked up the card and read the brief message. "You passed the first test, Alice. Now it is time to protect the real legacy. Trust no one, especially not the people in this file." The words anchored themselves in my mind. Passed the first test. The entire corporate war I had just waged was a curated simulation. The $50 million margin call, the poison pill protocol, the removal of the board chairman. It was a live-fire exercise designed to evaluate my capacity for ruthless logic. He used his own domestic company as the testing ground and his own son as the variable. He needed to verify my emotional restraint, ensuring I could execute a strategy without being blinded by family loyalty. I unfolded the archival paper. The letterhead bore the crest of a private banking institution located in Geneva. The routing numbers matched the IP addresses I had just traced on my terminal. It was a declaration of sovereign trust ownership. The legal phrasing transferred full signatory rights to me upon the validation of the initial California equity transfer. The balance was not listed, but the classification of the account indicated a tier reserved for international power brokers. This money existed beyond the reach of domestic tax agencies and federal prosecutors. It was untouchable capital. I set the banking document aside and picked up the black leather dossier. The cover felt thick and resilient against my palms. I opened it to the first page. Blocks of black marker obscured paragraphs of text, leaving only fragments of dates and geographical coordinates visible. But the photographs tucked between the pages remained untouched. I spread the glossed images across the oak desk. They were high-resolution surveillance photographs taken from concealed vantage points. The lighting was often harsh, capturing subjects in the shadows of private airstrips and secluded restaurant booths. The subjects were not local real estate developers or Silicon Valley venture capitalists. The first photograph depicted a foreign dignitary standing on a rain-slicked tarmac. I recognized his face from international news broadcasts. He governed a nation rich in rare earth minerals, maintaining a strict embargo on external trade. Yet in the photo, his shoulders were tense, his posture subservient. He was shaking hands with an unseen operative, transferring a silver briefcase. The second image captured a prominent tech billionaire, a man who controlled global data flow and satellite communications networks. He sat in a dimly lit booth in what appeared to be a high-end European club. He possessed a slouch of assumed dominance, yet he was signing a document passed to him by a figure obscured by the camera angle. The final photograph arrested my breathing. It was a clear, direct shot of my father. He stood on a private stone balcony overlooking a sprawling European cityscape. The architecture suggested Vienna or Prague. Beside him stood a powerful political figure, a man who orchestrated international trade policies and dictated the terms of global treaties. They were not smiling. They were reviewing a ledger, their expressions grave and intensely focused. My father did not look like a California commercial contractor in this image. The unassuming local businessman I grew up with was absent. He carried himself with the lethal, relaxed posture of a kingmaker. His stance dictated the terms of the interaction. The powerful politician beside him was leaning in, seeking approval. The reality of my father's existence crystallized. He was a power broker. He funneled capital across borders to shape geopolitical outcomes, utilizing the California real estate portfolio to launder his movements. He projected the mundane image of a local real estate magnate while secretly moving the levers of global authority. The hidden fortune in Geneva was the war chest he used to finance these operations. My mother spent her entire life believing she was managing a local millionaire. She curated her garden parties and manipulated the public will, assuming she controlled the narrative of the Miller family. She had no idea she was managing a ghost. Her pruning shears and social ambitions were microscopic details in a theater she could not even perceive. The people in the dossier were his clients, his partners, or perhaps his adversaries. Trust no one, especially not the people in this file. The political figure in the photograph possessed a cold, calculating gaze. If my father had died under suspicious circumstances, David Sterling was merely a pawn who got too close to the truth. Sterling orchestrated a local real estate theft, but the real enemy was operating on a global scale. I looked up from the photographs. The sun had disappeared entirely from the California coast. The San Francisco skyline transformed into a vast grid of cold, artificial lights stretching into the darkness. The glass windows reflected my own face back at me. The disinherited accountant was gone. The woman staring back was the heir to a shadow empire. The boardroom coup was finished. Nathan was confined to his gilded cage, a prisoner to his own debt guarantee. Patricia was stripped of her illusions, dismissed with a polite smile. But their world was a mere training ground compared to the arena I had just inherited. I reached out and picked up the new cream envelope. The heavy parchment felt familiar against my skin. I pressed my thumb against the dark red wax. The crest snapped under the pressure, the sound echoing in the empty executive suite. A new, terrifying corporate war had just been declared. A family is not merely a collection of shared genetic material or a group of people sitting around a mahogany dining table on Thanksgiving. A family is a complex architectural structure. It is built over decades, brick by brick, word by word, and silence by silence. When the foundation is poured with honesty and fairness, the structure can withstand almost any external pressure. But when the load-bearing walls are constructed from vanity, favoritism, and hidden agendas, the house does not need a storm to collapse. It will eventually crush itself under the weight of its own illusions. Looking back at the ruins of the Miller Empire, the true tragedy is not the corporate espionage, the margin calls, or the shadow ledgers hidden in subterranean vaults. The real tragedy is the profound failure of parenting. The story of Alice and Nathan is a chilling reflection of what happens when the fundamental duties of motherhood and fatherhood are outsourced to the preservation of optics and the feeding of fragile egos. In modern American society, we often place a premium on visible success, the corner office, the perfect country club smile, the flawless resume. But in the pursuit of that outward perfection, the internal emotional landscape of a child is often paved over. Consider Patricia's approach to raising her children. She looked at her son, a young man who consistently demonstrated a lack of discipline and a desperate need for external validation, and decided that the solution was not accountability. Instead of teaching him resilience, instead of allowing him to face the natural consequences of his failures, she built a padded room around him and called it a kingdom. She convinced her husband to alter the public succession plan to protect Nathan's pride. This is a devastating corruption of maternal responsibility. True emotional awareness in parenting requires the courage to let a child stumble, to let them feel the sting of a mistake so they can learn how to stand back up. By shielding Nathan from reality, Patricia did not protect him. She crippled him. She handed him the steering wheel of a high-speed machine without ever teaching him how to locate the brakes. He grew up believing he was invincible, making him the perfect bait for corporate predators. His arrogance was a cultivated defect pruned by a mother who valued symmetry over strength. Then there is the inverse of that toxic favoritism, the systemic erasure of the competent child. Alice was not ignored because she was inadequate. She was marginalized precisely because she was capable. In families that prioritize the illusion of harmony over the friction of truth, the strong child is often expected to simply endure. They are the quiet, load-bearing pillars, taking on the weight while the golden child receives the applause. Patricia justified her emotional abandonment of her daughter by framing Alice's independence as a lack of need. It is a haunting rationalization used by parents who lack the emotional depth to nurture a child they cannot easily control. The cost of this erasure is steep. It strips away the warmth of the traditional family structure, leaving behind a cold, calculating survivor. Alice learned to read spreadsheets instead of bedtime stories. She learned that trust is a liability and leverage is the only true currency. She won the corporate war, but she had to sever her own heart to do it. The victory is deeply satisfying on a strategic level, yet it leaves a lingering metallic taste of grief. A daughter should not have to wield a 1995 stock certificate like a weapon just to force her parents to see her worth. And what if the father, Richard Miller's legacy, is a labyrinth of brilliant financial architecture and staggering moral ambiguity? He recognized the danger circling his company. He saw the predators sitting in his boardroom, and he understood the fatal flaws in his own son. His solution was a masterpiece of corporate warfare, utilizing a blind trust and a dormant poison pill protocol to trap his enemies. But as a father, his strategy is a chilling betrayal. He weaponized his own children. He used Nathan as the sacrificial lamb, deliberately handing him a poisoned chalice to draw the traitors out of the shadows. He used Alice as the executioner, leaving her a trail of breadcrumbs and a loaded gun, expecting her to clean up the mess he left behind. Richard provided long-term guidance, but it was devoid of honesty. He operated in the shadows, substituting a genuine relationship for a high-stakes puzzle. He taught his daughter how to hunt, but he never taught her how to heal. In American culture, we frequently celebrate the self-made mogul, the patriarch who builds an empire from the ground up. We applaud the ruthless intellect required to dominate the market. Yet we rarely examine the domestic wreckage left in the wake of that ambition. A fortune, no matter how vast, cannot replace the fundamental human need for a father who speaks the truth while he is still alive to look you in the eye. Raising children is not a business transaction. It cannot be managed through offshore accounts, secret ledgers, or conditional affection. It requires a relentless commitment to fairness. It demands the emotional bandwidth to see each child for who they truly are, not for what you need them to be to maintain your own social standing. When parents fail to establish this foundation, the resulting damage echoes across generations. The children do not just inherit the wealth or the debt. They inherit the unhealed wounds, the quiet resentments, and the toxic survival mechanisms. They grow up and sit across from each other in cold, glass-walled boardrooms, trading away their humanity just to survive the fallout of their parents' choices. If you found yourself nodding along to the silent betrayals and the eventual cold justice in this story, you are not alone. These dynamics play out every day in quiet suburbs and towering high-rises, across kitchen tables and legal desks. If you appreciate narratives that dissect the dark, complex architecture of human relationships and the pursuit of ultimate retribution, I invite you to subscribe and follow the Linda Vengeance channel. We explore the stories that most people are too polite to tell, diving into the forensic details of family drama and the sharp, undeniable satisfaction of reclaiming your power. As you reflect on the Miller family, take a moment to look closely at your own environment. Look at the people you sit with during the holidays, the siblings you text, the parents you try to appease. Every family has a ledger. Some debts are financial, but the heaviest debts are always emotional. The questions we must ask ourselves are rarely simple. Are we building a foundation of truth, or are we just pruning the branches to make the tree look acceptable to the neighbors? Are you the architect of your own life? Or are you just living in a blueprint drafted by someone else's ego? The next time you walk into a quiet room and smell a familiar scent, or sit at a table where the silence speaks louder than the conversation, ask yourself, what is truly being built? Because sooner or later, the public will is read, the hidden envelopes are opened, and the truth always demands a signature. The only unknown variable is whose name will be on the line.